The last illustration that we want to look at on how worldviews affect how we see things is in the area of nature or creation. The animistic worldview that sees the physical realm as basically an illusion, and they see the spiritual realm as what is true, they have little interest in the care of creation because it's simply passing away. And often when Christians are impacted by this animistic idea, we have little concern for creation because we think it's passing away or it's all going to burn. But the animist sees that there's not much importance in this world. If you go to India, and a lot of people go to India because of its spirituality, but the thing that I've noticed in India, that the holy river is one of the most polluted rivers in the world. There's trash everywhere. Because in a Hindu framework, there's no reason to care for the earth. The secular framework is very different. We've used the picture of the world in a box to illustrate the basic idea of modern man. The material world is all there is. Resources are physical things, and they are in the ground. And because of that, they are limited. If you've had any kind of a Western education, you've heard of a man named Thomas Malthus and his theory, the Malthusian theory. And Thomas Malthus says that resources, if they grow at all, grow slowly by addition. Whereas mouths, human beings, grow in multiples. And he says in every country in the world, there'll come a point where there's going to be too many people for the resources. And in the world as a whole, there's going to be too many people for the resources. This idea is propagated from universities and the media today, and it's how most people think. Why are people poor? Because other people are rich. The rich have stolen from the poor, and there's a limited number of resources. The pie can only be cut so thinly, and if some nations are rich, it has to be because they have stolen from other nations. And how do you solve this problem? By redistributing resources. And we've seen this in the communist world and in the socialist world. The means of solving problems of poverty is moving money from one part of the world to another. But you'll notice in the graphic the biblical concept, the earth is outside the parameters of the frame. It's big, it's growing. And this is to indicate that the biblical concept of the nature of creation, the nature of resources is very different than that of the secular world. We read in Psalm 33:9, For he spoke, and it came to be. He commanded, and it stood firm. And now we're seeing this reaffirmed in the psalm. He spoke, and it came to be. Now turn to Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews 11, verse 3. By faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. Here is the biblical principle. The invisible God produced the visible universe. Because there is an invisible world, because God exists, and He stands outside of creation, the universe is an open system. God can intervene in the system, the angels can intervene in the system, and people made in the image of God can intervene in the system. In a materialistic framework, the system is closed. Resources are physical things in the ground, and they are limited, they are fixed in number. Two very different concepts. No, the invisible produces the visible. So where do resources come from? They don't come from the ground. They come from human imagination, from human creativity, human innovation. This is why in the graphic we have shown the world to be expanding, because resources are not limited. Resources can be grown. Now, this does not mean we do not have a responsibility to care for the resources that are in front of us. We do. We are made in the image of God. We're creatures in creation. We have a moral responsibility to care for creation. We cannot rape and pillage creation. But at the same time as we're to care for creation, we're to use our minds and take what God has given us and do something with it, make it productive. I remember years ago, my wife and I had the privilege of studying in Israel at the Institute for Holy Land Studies. And one weekend, every other weekend we'd go on a field trip, and on this one particular weekend we'd gone up into the northern part of Israel, and we were on a hill overlooking the valley of Megiddo. And our professor, Dr. Rainey, was lecturing about all the historic battles that had taken place in this valley. And while he was lecturing, my eyes were captivated by some trees, a forest actually, unlike any I'd seen before. I'd never seen a forest in the desert, so that was unusual. As I stared at this forest, I saw all the trees were planted in rows, and they were the same basic height. And I turned to Dr. Rainey and I said, Dr. Rainey, can you tell me about this forest? And he said, yes, the Jews planted it. And I thought, that's interesting. I thought only God planted forests. And now this man's telling me that a people planted this forest. And then he said something absolutely profound, that I did not know the significance of what he was saying until I went to Food for the Hungry years later. He said, Darrow, there are two different people that have inhabited this land. One people believed their God had cursed the land, and that's why it was a desert. The other people believed their God had said this land was a land of milk and honey. And within 2 generations, they'd transformed a desert into a garden. And they export fruit and vegetables and flowers all over the world. What was the difference? Both people inhabiting the same land, a desert, very little rain, no gold, no oil, just rock and sand. Beautiful rock and sand, but rock and sand. What was the difference? The difference was in the vision they had for the land. I have a friend, a Messianic Jew named Gila Garraway, and she was showing a group of Burundian pastors around Israel one time, and they stopped on the outskirts of a forest between Bethlehem and Jerusalem. And these pastors were mesmerized by this forest growing out of the sand and the rock. And they said to Gila, "Explain this forest to us." In our country, we have fertile, dark, fertile soil, and our forests grow in this black soil. Here they grow in rock and sand. And Gila said, God has given every people in the world a land. And when He comes back, He's going to ask each nation, what have you done with the land that I have given you? What is your vision for your land? And what, better yet, what is God's vision for your land? And what are you doing to see the fulfillment of the flourishing of your nation? Resources do not come from the ground. They come from the human imagination. Another example, this computer. Many of you own computers. But what is at the heart of the computer? It's a chip. And what is the chip made out of? It's made out of sand or silicon. Sand is virtually worthless. You find it everywhere. What transformed this worthless sand into something that people will pay $800 to $1,000 for? Maybe if you own a Mac, $1,500, $1,800 for? What transformed the sand into a piece of technology that people will pay a lot of money for? Human imagination. Wealth does not come from the ground. It comes from human imagination, human creativity, human innovation. I'd like you to reflect for a while on how the Malthusian theory has impacted your thinking in relationship to your life and to your work. And likewise, begin to ask God, how can I use the gifts and talents and abilities that you've given me to create wealth?